In March 1987, a warden named Alan Cho tipped the first of 300 sea otters over the side of a skiff into a stretch of California coast, so dead that biologists had counted exactly 0 kelp fronds there the autumn before. And every one of them was certain the animals had just been dropped into a grave. Subscribe. There are more of these comeback stories than you'd ever believe. The skiff idled over water the colour of weak tea, somewhere in a cove near Big Sur. Below it, the seabed was bare grey rock, carpeted end to end with sea urchins, spines shifting slowly, like a field of dark stones that had somehow learned to move, a place the surveys had quietly stopped visiting, filed away under a single flat word, a barren. Not a forest that had thinned, a forest that had been eaten down to the rock and then held there season after season by the very animals grazing it clean. The number that mattered that day wasn't 300, it was 0, not low, not almost none, 0, a clean round number that shouldn't exist on a living coast. 0 kelp fronds counted across 4 survey transects the autumn before, not thinned, not struggling, gone. And so everyone on that boat believed the same thing, that the otters would starve in a coast with nothing left to give. Picture the coast you're imagining right now, kelp, fish, movement, light coming down through green water. Now strip all of it out. That's what Alan Cho was looking at. That's not what happened. Within 19 months, something returned to that dead stretch of seabed that no restoration plan had ever managed to grow. And here's the part I still can't quite get over, and by the end of this, you'll understand why the scientists couldn't either. It wasn't just that it came back, it was the speed. Whatever brings a drowned forest back, it is supposed to be slow, measured in decades, in the patient stacking of one season onto the next. This coast didn't get decades, it got 19 months, and to this day, researchers still can't fully explain how. I'm Peter, and this is the full story of how 300 sea otters walked back into a dead California coast and switched the whole thing back on. We'll trace how a living coast dies in the first place. We'll get to the one counterintuitive mechanism almost nobody has heard explained plainly, the thing that makes this whole story make sense. And we'll get to the absurdly simple lever that reversed it, which is so simple it almost sounds like a trick. Because here's the thing to hold on to before we go any further. The otter isn't a resident of the kelp forest. It's the engineer that builds it, not a creature that lives among the fronds, the animal that decides whether the fronds get to exist at all. Take it away, and the whole cathedral of green comes down. That's not a metaphor. That is, more or less, exactly what happened here. And to understand a claim like that one small animal can build an entire forest, it never grows. You first have to see it in reverse. You have to watch a coast switch off. Because 100 years before Alan Cho lowered those 300 otters into the water, someone had already reached in and pulled the engineer out. By 1938, there were barely 50 otters left in the entire range, hiding below a single creek. And the moment they were gone, the seabed began to turn to stone. Stone is the right word for it, not sand, not silt, stone, because the men who did this never touched the kelp either. They came for the fur. The southern sea otter has the densest coat of any animal on earth, and for 100 years that coat was a currency. Schooners worked this coast pelt by pelt, cove by cove, and the numbers fell the way numbers fall when nobody is counting yet, from tens of thousands down and down and down. By 1938, there were barely 50 of them left in the entire range, a single relict band hiding in the kelp shadow below Bixby Creek, 50 animals, where there had once been a coastline full. And here is the thing almost nobody explains plainly. When you pulled those otters out, you didn't just remove an animal. You unlocked a door that had been holding a whole forest shut. It works like this. The otter doesn't grow kelp. It never has. What the otter eats is sea urchins, those slow purple pincushions grazing along the seabed. And what the urchins eat is kelp. 3 links in a chain. Otter eats urchin eats kelp, kelp holds the coast together. Take out the top link, and the chain doesn't just shorten, it runs backwards. Here's the part that genuinely unsettled the researchers, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. The otter never touches the kelp. It builds the forest by killing the thing that eats the forest. Scientists have a name for this, a trophic cascade. 1 predator, 3 links up, deciding whether an entire forest gets to exist. So the otters vanish, and the urchins do what any animal does when its predator is gone. They explode, millions of them unchecked, grinding across the rock. They mow the kelp down to stumps, and then, this is the cruel part, they don't leave. They stay, they hold the ground. A carpet of spines over bare stone, eating anything green the moment it tries to grow back. Biologists have a name for that too. An urchin barren. And a barren is not simply an empty place. It is a wasteland that defends itself. Every kelp spore that drifts in and tries to root gets eaten before it's the size of your fingernail. So the coast can wait a year, 10 years, 50 years, and nothing changes. 0 kelp fronds. 0. Not falling anymore, just held there at 0 by a system that has locked itself shut. A beautiful blue, nothing over grey rock. We know how total the collapse was because someone finally measured it. A 2004 paper in the journal Ecology Letters compared coasts side by side. Otter coasts against otter-free coasts, the same water, the same rock, just a headland apart. The coasts with otters held up to 12 times the kelp density of the ones without. 12 times, not because the otters were gardening, because they were hunting. Which brings us to the fix. And I'll be honest, after all that, you might expect something clever. Some vast marine engineering project, divers seeding kelp by hand, urchins hauled out by the ton. That's what people tried in places. It doesn't hold. What actually worked was almost embarrassing in its simplicity. It was patience, and then it was subtraction. Biologists spent years, decades, quietly nursing that relic band of 50 back up under something called a translocation program, growing the animals, waiting. And then, when there were finally enough, they did the one thing that a locked coast cannot defend against. If you've made it this far, you already understand more about how a coast works than most people ever will. So here's the lever that reversed it, and how absurdly simple it was. They put the engineer back, because the otter is not a resident of the kelp forest. It's the engineer that builds it. Put the animal back and get out of its way. So they did the one simple thing. They carried 300 otters out to the dead coast, lowered them into water the colour of weak tea, and left. And then everyone waited. 19 months later, what had come back was not just kelp. It was something no one had released a single otter to create. Something a 2012 team would eventually trace all the way down into the water itself. And its estimated value ran to $10 billion. 19 months. That's how long the coast held its breath. And then, over a single stretch of cleared rock, where the survey teams had counted 0 fronds, 0 canopy, 0 life worth logging, the first thin blades of kelp lifted off the seabed and reached for the light. They didn't stop. Within a season, the blades became a stand, and the stand became a canopy, that golden ceiling of a living kelp forest, swaying in the swell. The urchins had thinned. The otters had done the one thing otters do, and the door that had been locked for a lifetime simply opened. Rockfish moved in under the fronds, the way they always had before anyone alive could remember. Then the seals came to hunt the rockfish. Link by link, from the top down, the whole system switched back on, faster than any biologist watching had dared to predict. But the strangest thing that returned was never something you could photograph. In 2012, a study in the journal NAS went looking not at the fish or the kelp, but at the water itself, and at what the water was quietly doing with carbon. Growing kelp, it turns out, pulls carbon dioxide out of the sea the way a forest pulls it out of the air. And a coast full of otters, they found, grows so much more kelp than a coast without them that the difference was measurable on a scale nobody had thought to weigh. Across the range, the recovering forests were storing carbon they put a value on, up to $10 billion in stored value. And this is the part that stunned the biologists, the thing they were not even looking for. Stay with me, because nobody saw this coming. Nobody released a single otter to fight carbon. Nobody drew up a climate plan or a spreadsheet or a target. You put a predator back to eat some sea urchins, and a coastline turned into one of the most efficient carbon engines on the Pacific shelf. It came free. The otter isn't a resident of the kelp forest. It's the engineer that builds it. And here at last was the proof, written into the chemistry of the water. You could even see it. The water that had sat the colour of weak tea over the barren, murky, thick, lifeless, ran clear again. Blue-green, bright, shot through with moving shadows. When a coast comes back, it changes colour, and anyone standing on the cliffs could read the good news without a single instrument. Now, I want to be honest about what this does not solve. The southern sea otter is still listed as threatened. Great white sharks bite them and often kill them, and no forest recovery has changed that. The population has stalled for years now, near 3,000 animals, a fraction of what these coasts once held. And plenty of dead coast up and down California still has no otters in it at all, still lies bare, still waits. This is not a finished miracle. I'd be lying if I dressed it up as one. But here is the detail that outlasted the animals themselves. The Rumsen people lived on this coast long before the fur trade, long before the barrens, and they had a word for the otter, their own name for the small dark swimmer that worked the kelp. The otters were hunted out. 100 years passed with none, and still, down the shore, a cove carries a version of that word to this day, a place named for an animal that had been gone for a century. The word outlasted the animal, and then the animal came back to meet it. That, to me, is the heart of it. We spend so long thinking of these creatures as the fragile ones, the ones we rescue, the patients we tend. But that's backwards. They aren't the patients here. They're the medicine. Tell me in the comments which coast you'd bring back first, and subscribe, because there are more of these comeback stories than you'd ever believe. Somewhere off Big Sur, over water that isn't weak tea anymore, an otter rolls onto its back, sets a sea urchin on its chest, and cracks it open. The small, ordinary work of an engineer at rest, on a coast it built twice. Thanks for watching.